It was a calm and peaceful afternoon when Sarah Williams finished her work and got into her silver car. The day had been long, but she felt light and happy knowing she was heading home. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with soft orange and pink colors. A cool breeze brushed through the trees as she drove along the quiet road. She turned up the radio, humming to her favorite song, completely unaware that something unexpected was about to happen. The road was almost empty. A few cars passed by now and then, but it was mostly quiet. Just Sarah, her thoughts, and the open road ahead. She looked at the clock. It was 6:45 p.m., the perfect time to get home, cook dinner, and spend the evening with her husband David and their 2 kids. Everything felt normal, peaceful, and safe. But suddenly something broke that calm. Out of nowhere, bright flashing lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Red and blue lights blinked rapidly and a loud siren wailed for a second before going silent. Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel. For a moment she thought maybe the police car wanted to pass her, but when she moved slightly to the side, the car followed her closely. That's when she realized they were pulling her over. Her heart began to beat faster. She quickly glanced at her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. Her seatbelt was on. She hadn't run a stop sign or broken any rule she could think of. Confused and nervous, she carefully pulled her car to the side of the road and stopped. The police lights continued to flash, painting her car's interior in red and blue. Sarah took a deep breath. "Okay, stay calm," she whispered to herself. She rolled down her window halfway and placed both hands on the steering wheel, just like she had seen people do on TV. Her mind raced through every possibility. Maybe they had mistaken her for someone else. Maybe there was something wrong with her car. But deep down she couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. A minute later, 2 police officers stepped out of their patrol car. Both were wearing dark uniforms and stern expressions. One of them, a tall man with sunglasses still on despite the dimming light, walked toward her slowly. The other officer stayed behind, circling near her car as if he was inspecting it. Sarah tried to smile politely when the officer reached her window. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" she asked softly. The officer leaned slightly toward her. His voice was firm. "License and registration." Sarah blinked. "Of course," she replied quickly, reaching into her purse with slow, careful movements. She didn't want to make any sudden gestures. She knew how tense these moments could be. She handed him her license and registration through the window. "May I ask what this is about?" The officer didn't answer. He looked at her ID, then glanced back at her car. "Just a routine stop," he said flatly. Sarah's confusion deepened. A routine stop? For what reason? She hadn't done anything wrong. The other officer, still circling the car, shone his flashlight through the back window, peering inside as if searching for something. Sarah could feel her chest tightening. "Is everything okay?" she asked again, trying to keep her voice steady. The officer didn't reply. Instead, he took her license and walked back to his car, leaving her sitting there alone with fear starting to grow in her chest. The flashing lights still blinked behind her, and every passing car slowed down to stare. She felt embarrassed and helpless. Minutes passed like hours. Sarah tried to breathe normally, but her mind kept spinning. What if they think I did something wrong? What if this turns into something serious? She remembered stories she'd seen online. People being stopped for no reason and treated unfairly. She hoped this wasn't one of those times. Then the officer returned, still wearing that unreadable expression. "Where are you coming from, ma'am?" He asked. "From work," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm heading home. Do you live around here?" He continued. "Yes, just a few miles away," she said, still polite but growing uneasy. "Officer, can I please know what's going on?" Instead of answering directly, the man asked again, "Do you know why we stopped you?" Sarah shook her head. "No, I really don't." The officer looked at her for a moment, then said, "You matched the description of a vehicle involved in a disturbance earlier." Her mouth fell open slightly. "A disturbance?" "I've been at work all day," she said. There must be some mistake. He didn't respond. The second officer had now joined him near her window, both staring in, assessing her. Sarah felt her heart pound faster. She wasn't sure what they were thinking, and that uncertainty scared her more than anything. The sky had now darkened, and the lights of the police car flashed brighter against the fading daylight. Sarah's phone was sitting in the passenger seat. For a moment, she thought about calling her husband David, but she hesitated. She didn't want to make things worse. Still, something told her she might need help if this continued. The taller officer sighed and said, "Wait here." He walked back again to his car. Sarah's hands were trembling slightly now. She wasn't guilty of anything, yet she felt like a criminal sitting there, watched and judged for no reason at all. Finally, after several long minutes, she made a decision. She reached for her phone and quietly called David. Her voice was soft but shaky. "Honey, I got pulled over," she said. "I don't know why. They said it was routine, but I'm scared." David's voice on the other end was calm but serious. "Where are you?" he asked. When she told him the location, he said firmly, "Stay in the car. Don't argue. I'm coming." Sarah hung up, trying to breathe, trying to stay strong. The road felt colder now, the night creeping in faster. The flashing lights still danced in her mirrors. She sat there waiting, unaware that her husband's arrival would soon turn this entire situation upside down. Sarah sat in her car, hands still gripping the steering wheel tightly. The flashing lights behind her painted the inside of her car in shades of red and blue, again and again. Her heart hadn't stopped racing since the moment she pulled over. The sound of the police radio crackling in the distance only made her more nervous. She tried to calm herself down, taking slow breaths, but her thoughts wouldn't stop spinning. She kept asking herself the same question over and over. Why did they stop me? What did I do wrong? She had always followed the rules. No speeding, no texting, no illegal turns. Yet here she was, sitting on the side of the road like she had done something terrible. The taller officer finally came back. His face was serious, and he didn't bother to hide his suspicion. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," he said firmly. Sarah froze for a moment. "Step out?" "Did I do something wrong, officer?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Just step out," he repeated, his tone sharp and impatient. Her stomach twisted with fear. Still, she did as she was told. She slowly opened the door, stepped onto the cold pavement, and closed it behind her. The air felt different now, heavy, tense. She could feel the eyes of the second officer watching her closely from the other side. "Please stand here," the tall officer said, motioning toward the front of her car. Sarah obeyed. Cars passed by occasionally, slowing down to look at the flashing lights. She could almost feel their judgment, people thinking she must have done something wrong. One of the officers began walking around her car again, shining his flashlight inside through every window. He even crouched down to peek under the back seat. Sarah watched, feeling both scared and insulted. "What are you looking for?" she finally asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "Just following procedure," the officer replied, not looking at her. "Procedure for what?" she asked softly. "You said this was a routine stop." This time, the officer didn't answer. He just kept searching. The tall one stood near her, arms crossed, watching her every move. Sarah looked down at her shoes, feeling small and powerless. Then, as if things weren't strange enough, the officer asked, "You been drinking tonight?" Sarah's head snapped up in surprise. "No, of course not. I just came from work," she said quickly. The officer nodded slowly, as if not convinced. "You seem nervous," he said. She blinked in disbelief. "Wouldn't you be nervous if you were pulled over for no reason?" she asked gently. That seemed to annoy him. He frowned. "Ma'am, we'll ask the questions." Sarah bit her lip. She didn't want to argue. She just wanted to go home, but deep inside, anger was starting to mix with her fear. This wasn't right. She hadn't done anything wrong, yet she was being treated like a suspect. The other officer came back and whispered something to his partner. Sarah couldn't hear what they said, but she noticed the way they looked at each other, suspiciously, almost like they were searching for a reason to justify what they were doing. Finally, she said softly, "Officers, I'm really sorry, but I'd like to know why you stopped me. Did my car match a report or something?" The taller officer sighed, clearly irritated. "We received a call about a vehicle similar to yours being involved in a minor disturbance earlier. We just need to check things out." Sarah shook her head. "That can't be. I drove straight from my office. You can even check my work ID or GPS history if you want." But her words didn't seem to matter. The officer just looked away, muttering something under his breath. Sarah could feel the weight of the situation pressing down harder. She wasn't just being questioned, she was being doubted, dismissed, and disrespected. Minutes passed. One of the officers leaned into his patrol car, probably checking her ID. The other stayed close, still watching her like a hawk. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was David, her husband. She didn't answer yet. She didn't want to cause more trouble by making a call in front of them. When the officer came back, his expression had changed slightly, not calmer but colder. "We didn't find anything," he said, almost sounding disappointed. Sarah exhaled slowly. "Then am I free to go?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at her for a long second, as if trying to decide whether to let her leave or not. Then finally he said, "In a minute." That minute stretched endlessly. Sarah stood there under the flashing lights, feeling exposed and helpless. Every car that passed made her wish the ground would open up and swallow her whole. Inside, she could feel her frustration rising. "Why me?" she thought. "Why treat me this way when I've done nothing wrong?" But she knew better than to argue. She had seen enough stories to know that talking back could make things worse. At last, she whispered, "Please, officer, I just want to go home." The taller officer's jaw tightened. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he gave a small nod to his partner. "Fine, stay where you are," he said, walking back toward the patrol car again. Sarah turned her head slightly and glanced down the road. The sun had almost disappeared now, leaving only the pale blue of early night. Her heart still raced. She thought about David, her husband, the man who had sworn to protect people as a police officer himself. She knew that if he were here, things would be very different. And just as that thought crossed her mind, she heard something. The familiar sound of a car engine slowing down behind the flashing lights. Her heart skipped a beat. It was David. At that moment, everything was about to change. Sarah's heart jumped when she saw the familiar shape of her husband's car stopping a few meters behind the flashing police lights. The sound of his engine slowing down was like a small piece of comfort in the middle of a storm. She didn't move, she didn't dare, but her eyes filled with relief. David stepped out calmly, but there was something strong and steady about his walk. He was still wearing his off-duty jacket, and under it, the faint glint of his badge caught the light. His face was serious, his eyes sharp, not angry but focused. He had seen this kind of situation before, but never thought it would involve his own wife. The two officers turned quickly when they saw another man approaching. Their expressions changed immediately. Surprise first, then confusion. "Sir, please stay back," one of them called out firmly. David didn't stop walking. "That's my wife," he said clearly, his voice calm but full of authority. "What's going on here?" The taller officer frowned. "Sir, we're handling a situation. You'll need to step aside." David reached into his jacket slowly and held up his badge. "I'm handling one too," he replied. The officers froze. For a moment, everything went silent, except for the faint hum of the police car engine and the buzz of the flashing lights. The tall officer's tone softened instantly. "You're an officer?" he asked awkwardly. David nodded. "Detective David Williams, Metro Police." He looked straight at him. "Now I'll ask again. Why is my wife standing here like she's under arrest?" Sarah could feel the shift in the air. The power dynamic had changed in an instant. The same officers who had been so intimidating a few minutes ago now looked uncomfortable, even nervous. The taller one cleared his throat. We stopped her because her vehicle matched the description of another car involved in an incident earlier. It was just a precaution." David's eyes narrowed slightly. "A precaution? You asked her to step out of her car and searched her vehicle for a traffic stop that had no clear reason?" The shorter officer quickly interrupted. "We didn't search the vehicle, sir. We just looked." David raised a hand. "You don't need to explain to me what I just saw on my wife's dash camera." Both officers blinked. "Dash camera?" one repeated. "Yes," David said simply. "She has one installed, front and back. So every word, every action, every second of what just happened is recorded." The two men looked at each other. Sarah could see the panic flicker across their faces. She stayed quiet, watching the scene unfold. For the first time since the stop began, she felt safe. David turned toward her gently. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked softly. Sarah nodded, though her voice trembled. "I'm fine now." David looked back at the officers. "You've made her feel like a criminal for no reason. You said this was a routine stop, but routine stops don't involve intimidation." The taller officer stammered. "Sir, we didn't mean to make her feel then why did you ask her if she'd been drinking?" David interrupted sharply. "Did she smell of alcohol? Did she slur her words? Or was she just nervous because two officers treated her like a suspect for existing?" The silence that followed was heavy. The officers didn't know where to look. Finally, David took a slow breath. "Look," he said, his voice calm again. "I know this job. I've been doing it for 15 years. I know the stress. I know the instinct to be cautious. But there's a line between being cautious and being careless. You crossed that line tonight." The taller officer lowered his eyes. "We're sorry, Detective. It was a misunderstanding." David nodded slightly, but his tone stayed firm. "Then you should apologize to her, not to me." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. The officers hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but after a brief pause, the shorter one spoke first. "Ma'am, we apologize for the inconvenience. It was never our intention to upset you." Sarah nodded politely. "Thank you," she said quietly. But inside she knew this apology wasn't enough to erase the fear she had felt minutes ago. David could see it in her eyes too. He stepped closer to her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're done here," he told her gently. "Get in the car. I'll handle the rest." Sarah obeyed, her hand still trembling slightly as she opened the car door and sat down. Through the windshield, she could see David talking to the officers. Calm, professional, but firm. The tone was different now. They were listening. As she sat there watching him, a strange mix of emotions filled her. Relief, pride, and sadness. Relief that he had come. Pride that he had stood up for her. And sadness that it took a badge for the truth to be respected. After a few minutes, David walked back to her car, the officers now standing by their vehicle, avoiding eye contact. He opened her door and smiled gently. "It's over," he said softly. Sarah looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Would it have been over if you hadn't come?" David didn't answer right away. He just sighed and squeezed her hand. "That's what we need to change," he finally said. They drove away quietly. The flashing lights faded in the distance, but the memory didn't. Sarah looked out the window, her reflection blending with the darkening sky. She had always trusted the system. Now, she understood how fragile that trust could be. And though the road ahead was calm again, deep inside, she knew one thing for sure. That night had changed something in both of them. Forever. As David and Sarah drove home that night, the streetlights flickered past them like silent witnesses to what had just happened. Neither of them spoke for a while. The soft hum of the car engine filled the silence, but their minds were loud. Sarah stared out the window, still replaying the moment those flashing lights appeared behind her. Her hands were resting in her lap, but they still felt shaky. Her husband's badge had changed everything, not because it should have, but because it had to. That thought kept circling in her head like a haunting echo. Finally, David glanced at her. "You okay?" he asked gently. Sarah gave a faint smile. "I'm trying to be," she said quietly. "It's just, I didn't think something like that could happen to me." David nodded. "It shouldn't have happened. Not to you, not to anyone." They drove in silence again. The night air outside looked peaceful, but inside the car, the weight of what had happened hung heavy. Later that evening, after they reached home, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed while David hung up his jacket. She looked down at her hands and said softly, "When they told me to step out of the car, I felt like I didn't matter. Like I wasn't even human to them." David stopped what he was doing. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and anger. "You do matter," he said firmly. "You always have. That's exactly why I became a cop. To stop people from being treated like that." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "Then why do people like that still wear the same badge you do?" David didn't answer right away. He walked over, sat beside her, and took her hand gently. "Because some people forget what the badge means," he said quietly. "It's supposed to stand for protection, not power." She nodded slowly, understanding but still hurt. "When I called you, I was so scared," she admitted. "I didn't know what to say. I just needed to hear your voice." David squeezed her hand. "You did the right thing, Sarah. You stayed calm. You didn't argue. That's what kept you safe until I got there." Sarah sighed, looking down. "I shouldn't have to be safe from the police, David." Those words hit him hard. He looked away for a moment, swallowing his emotions. "You're right," he finally said. "You shouldn't have to." A heavy silence followed. The clock ticked softly in the background. Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder, and for the first time since the stop she let herself cry, quietly, but deeply. All the fear, the confusion, the humiliations, it poured out. David wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. "It's over," he whispered, though even he didn't fully believe it. He knew the night's events would leave a mark, a memory that wouldn't fade so easily. After a while, Sarah pulled back and wiped her tears. "What happens now?" she asked softly. David looked at her thoughtfully. "Now," he repeated, "now I make sure it doesn't happen again. Not to you, not to anyone else." Sarah tilted her head, curious. "What do you mean?" "I'm going to talk to the department," he said. "Not to get them in trouble, but to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug. I've seen too many things brushed aside. This time I won't stay quiet." Sarah's eyes widened a little. "Will that cause problems for you?" David smiled faintly. "Maybe, but doing nothing would be worse." She nodded, her expression softening. In that moment, she was reminded why she had fallen in love with him. His calm, his strength, his belief in doing what was right, even when it wasn't easy. Before going to bed, Sarah picked up her phone and replayed the dashcam footage. She didn't know why. Maybe to remind herself that she hadn't imagined it. Every second of the stop was there, crystal clear. The flashing lights, the officer's cold tone, her own nervous voice. She pressed pause halfway through and whispered to herself, "This shouldn't happen to anyone." David, watching from the doorway, heard her words. "That's exactly why you called me," he said softly. "And that's why I'm going to make sure someone listens." The next morning, David kept his promise. He went to the station early, still in his plain clothes. The same badge that had made 2 officers freeze last night now hung around his neck again. But this time, it carried more than authority. It carried purpose. He met with his captain and explained everything that happened, showing him the dashcam footage. The captain watched quietly, frowning as the video played. When it ended, he leaned back and sighed. "You're right, David," he said. "This is not how we do things. I'll handle it." David nodded. "I'm not asking for punishment. I'm asking for awareness, for training, for empathy." The captain nodded again, this time slower. "I understand." When David left the station that day, he felt both proud and sad. Proud that he stood up for what was right, but sad that he even had to. That night when he came home, Sarah greeted him at the door. "How did it go?" she asked. He smiled. "Better than I expected. Maybe this time things will actually change." Sarah smiled back, though a small part of her still doubted. "I hope so," she whispered. "For everyone's sake." As they sat together on the couch, the TV played quietly in the background. A news report about police reform. David glanced at it, then looked back at Sarah. "Funny," he said softly. "It feels different when it happens to your own family." Sarah nodded. "Maybe that's how real change begins," she replied. Outside, the night was quiet again, but not empty. It felt like the beginning of something new. The next day began quietly, almost too quietly. The morning sun slipped through the curtains, painting soft golden lines across the floor. Sarah was sitting by the window, sipping her coffee, still lost in thought. She hadn't slept well. Every time she closed her eyes, the flashing red and blue lights from the night before came back, like ghosts that refused to fade. David walked into the kitchen, his badge clipped to his belt, his face calm but unreadable. He gave her a small smile. "You didn't sleep, did you?" She shook her head. "Not much. Every time I close my eyes, I keep seeing their faces. The way they looked at me, like I was guilty before I even spoke." David pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "That's why today matters," he said gently. "This isn't over yet." Sarah looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" "I have a meeting with the chief this morning. Those 2 officers are being called in too. I asked for it," he said firmly. "They need to face what they did." Her heart skipped. "You're going to be there?" "Yes," he said. "And so are you if you want to be." Sarah hesitated for a moment. A part of her wanted to stay home and forget everything, but another part, the stronger part, wanted to stand beside her husband and let the truth speak for itself. She nodded slowly. "I'll go." 2 hours later, they arrived at the precinct. The atmosphere inside was tense but quiet. Officers moved around, talking in low voices. Some glanced at Sarah, curious, maybe even sympathetic. She felt out of place among all the uniforms, but David walked beside her confidently, his presence a steady shield. When they reached the meeting room, the 2 officers from last night were already there, sitting stiffly at the table. They looked very different in daylight. No flashing lights, no sunglasses, no power. Just two men who suddenly looked small. The chief, a broad-shouldered man with kind but serious eyes, stood at the front of the room. "Detective Williams," he said as David entered. "Thank you for coming. Please take a seat." David nodded and sat beside Sarah. The room was quiet enough that you could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights above. The chief looked at the two officers. "I've reviewed the dashcam footage," he began, his voice calm but firm. "It's clear that this stop was not handled properly." The taller officer swallowed hard. "Sir, You thought wrong," the chief interrupted. "You stopped a driver without clear cause. You escalated without reason, and worst of all, you showed no respect." The officers shifted uncomfortably. One of them mumbled, "We didn't know she was Detective Williams' wife." David leaned forward slightly. His tone was calm, but every word hit like a hammer. "That's exactly the problem. You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect." The chief nodded. "He's right." He turned to the officers again. What if she wasn't his wife? What if she was just any other woman driving home after work? Would you have treated her the same way? Neither of them answered. The silence said enough. Sarah sat quietly, her heart heavy but strong. She wasn't angry anymore, just disappointed. She looked at the men in front of her and said softly, "You made me feel like I didn't belong in my own city. I wasn't rude. I wasn't hiding anything. I was just scared. And you didn't care." Her words hit harder than any punishment could. The officers looked down, unable to meet her eyes. The chief cleared his throat. "This department exists to protect people, not frighten them. You both will undergo retraining and suspension without pay for 2 weeks. And I expect you to remember this moment every time you put on that badge." The officers nodded weakly. "Yes, sir," they said almost in unison. David exhaled slowly. It wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. For the first time since that night, he felt something close to relief. As they stood to leave, one of the officers, the shorter one, turned to Sarah. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice shaking a little. "I'm truly sorry for what happened. I wasn't thinking right." "You didn't deserve that," Sarah nodded. "Thank you," she said simply. It wasn't forgiveness, and not yet, but it was a start. Outside the station, the sun was high and warm. Sarah took a deep breath of fresh air and felt a small piece of the heaviness lift from her shoulders. David looked at her and smiled faintly. "You did good in there." "So did you," she replied. "You stood up for me, for what's right." He shook his head. "No, we stood up together." They walked toward their car hand in hand, feeling lighter than they had in days. But deep inside, both knew this moment wasn't just about them. It was about something bigger. A truth that needed to be seen, spoken and remembered. Later that night, as they sat together watching the sunset from their porch, Sarah whispered, "You know what the hardest part was?" David looked at her curiously. "What?" "Knowing that if you hadn't shown up, things might have ended differently," she said quietly. David didn't answer right away. He just nodded slowly. "And that's why it has to change," he said. "Not just for you, but for everyone who doesn't have someone with a badge to protect them." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes on the fading orange sky. The world outside was still flawed, but at least now she knew there were people willing to make it better. The truth had come out. And sometimes that's the most powerful thing of all. The air outside the police station felt different that morning. Lighter, calmer, almost as if the truth itself had cleared the weight hanging over them. Sarah and David walked silently toward their car, the sound of their footsteps echoing softly against the concrete. Neither spoke at first. The meeting had been draining, emotional, necessary, but heavy. The faces of those two officers still lingered in Sarah's mind, not because of anger, but because of realization. She had seen fear in their eyes, not the kind of fear she had felt that night, but the fear of being exposed, the fear of realizing they had forgotten what their job really meant. David opened the car door for her and smiled faintly. "You did amazing in there," he said. Sarah shook her head. "I just told the truth. And sometimes," David replied quietly, "the truth is the strongest thing you can say." As they drove away from the station, Sarah looked out the window, watching the city move. People walking, kids playing, cars rushing by, normal life. But for her, normal didn't feel the same anymore. Something inside her had changed. The world hadn't suddenly become safer, but her eyes had opened. When they reached home, David's phone began buzzing. messages from fellow officers, and even a few old colleagues. Word had spread quickly about what had happened at the precinct. Some messages were short. "Good job, man." Others were longer, thanking him for standing up and speaking out. He set the phone down and sighed. "Looks like everyone's talking," he said with a small smile. Sarah smiled back. "Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe they'll think twice next time." Later that afternoon, David was called into the department for a special briefing. He wasn't sure what to expect. When he arrived, he found a small group of officers gathered in the training room. Some of them were new recruits, others were veterans, but all of them were there to talk about what had happened. The captain stood at the front of the room. "Today's session isn't about rules or procedures," he began. "It's about respect. It's about remembering that every person we stop, every driver we speak to is a human being. We make mistakes, but what matters is that we learn from them." David listened quietly. He wasn't here to boast or point fingers. He was here because change begins with honesty. When the captain turned to him and said, "Detective Williams, would you share a few words?" And David stood up slowly. He looked around the room, meeting every pair of eyes before speaking. "Last week my wife was pulled over for no reason," he began. "She was calm, polite, respectful, and she was treated like a suspect anyway. Not because she did anything wrong, but because two officers forgot what this badge stands for." The room fell silent. David continued, his voice steady but emotional. "That badge," he said, tapping his chest, "is not a symbol of control. It's a promise, and to protect people, not scare them. To treat them fairly, even when no one's watching. My wife didn't deserve fear. No one does." He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. "Power isn't about making people afraid. Real power is when people trust you enough to feel safe." The captain nodded approvingly. Some of the officers looked down, thoughtful. A few even clapped quietly when David finished. After the meeting, one young officer, probably fresh out of training, walked up to him and said, "Sir, I heard about what happened. I just want to say, I don't ever want to make someone feel that way. Ever." David smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "That's how change starts," he said. Back at home that evening, Sarah was waiting for him. When he walked in, she could tell by his expression that something had shifted. "How did it go?" she asked. "It went better than I thought," he said, sitting beside her. "People are listening. Maybe what happened wasn't just bad luck. Maybe it was a wake-up call." Sarah nodded softly. "Sometimes it takes something painful to open people's eyes." David leaned back, looking tired but hopeful. "You know what the captain said?" he asked. "He's starting a new training session, one that focuses on empathy, communication, and respect. He wants me to help lead it." Sarah's eyes brightened. "Really?" he smiled. "Yeah." He said it's time the department stopped seeing civilians as suspects first. For the first time since that night, Sarah felt something new. Not anger, not fear, but pride. Her husband hadn't just protected her. He had turned something unfair into something meaningful. That evening, they sat together on the porch again, watching the sunset. The sky glowed with streaks of orange and pink, much like the evening of that terrible day, but this time, the air felt peaceful. Sarah looked at David and said quietly, "When those officers stopped me, I felt small. I felt powerless. But today, I feel strong. Not because of revenge, but because something good came out of it." David smiled, reaching for her hand. "That's what real strength is," he said, turning fear into purpose. As the sky darkened, the first stars began to appear, tiny lights breaking through the shadows. Sarah watched them twinkle and thought about how fragile yet powerful light could be. That night, she wrote a small post online, not to complain, but to share her experience. She wrote about what happened, about how her husband stood up for her, and about how change had begun. The post went viral, shared thousands of times, touching hearts across the country. People from all walks of life commented, some police officers, some citizens, all agreeing on one thing. Respect and empathy should never depend on a badge. For Sarah and David, the power had shifted, not from person to person, but from fear to truth, and sometimes that's the only shift that truly matters. Days passed quietly after the meeting at the station. The air in Sarah and David's home felt lighter, though the memories of that night still lived quietly in the corners of their minds. Life began to return to normal. Coffee in the mornings, laughter from the kids, and calm evening walks after dinner. But deep inside, Sarah knew something had changed forever, not just in her, but in the people around her too. A few days later, David received an unexpected call from the precinct. The captain wanted both him and Sarah to come in for a short follow-up meeting. "It's important," the captain had said, "and I think it might bring some peace." Sarah hesitated at first. The idea of stepping into that building again made her uneasy. She didn't want to relive the tension, the fear, or the humiliation. But David encouraged her gently. "Sometimes healing isn't quiet," he told her. "Sometimes it's face-to-face." So they went. When they arrived, the captain greeted them warmly and led them into a small conference room. Inside, the two officers from that night were already seated, looking nervous but calm. The taller one had his hands folded tightly, while the shorter one stared at the table as if ashamed to look up. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was heavy, not angry but full of unspoken regret. Finally, the captain cleared his throat. "Detective Williams, Mrs. Williams," he began, "thank you for coming. These two officers have something they'd like to say." Sarah's heart thumped quietly in her chest. She looked across the table, her eyes steady but kind. The taller officer was the first to speak. His voice was lower than she remembered, quieter, uncertain. "Mrs. Williams," he began slowly, "I've replayed that night in my head over and over. I can't justify what we did. We stopped you without real cause. We spoke to you in a way no officer should ever speak to anyone. I let my assumptions take over my judgment. And I'm sorry." Sarah didn't move. She just listened, every word hitting a memory she had tried to forget. Then the shorter officer spoke. His hands were shaking slightly. "Ma'am," he said, "I've been on the force for 8 years. I thought I understood what my job was about. Control, safety, keeping order. But after that night, I realized I'd forgotten the most important part. Compassion. I saw the footage. I saw your fear. And I hated the person I saw in that video. I'm sorry." Sarah looked down for a moment, taking a deep breath. She had imagined hearing those words, but actually hearing them. The sincerity, the guilt, felt heavier than she expected. David placed a comforting hand on her knee under the table. The captain spoke next. "They both volunteered to undergo extended retraining," he said. "They'll be part of a new mentorship program, one that Detective Williams helped design. It focuses on empathy, communication, and accountability." David nodded slowly. "That's a start," he said softly. Sarah looked up at the officers again. "I accept your apology," she said quietly. "But I hope you understand it wasn't just about me. Every time something like this happens, it makes people afraid. And fear and trust can't live together. Not in the same world." The taller officer nodded, his eyes moist. "You're right," he said. "We forgot that." For a moment, there was silence again, but this time it wasn't tense. It was human. Then the captain stood up and said, "I want to thank you both. What happened that night was wrong, but how you chose to handle it, that's what's turning it into something right." After the meeting, as they walked out of the station, Sarah paused near the entrance. She turned back slightly and saw the two officers still inside, talking quietly to the captain. For the first time, she didn't feel anger when she looked at them. She felt something different, understanding, maybe even hope. Outside, the sun was shining, bright and warm, almost symbolic. Sarah took a deep breath and said, "You know, for a long time I thought apologies didn't fix anything. But today, it felt different." David smiled. "Because it wasn't just an apology," he said. "It was a lesson learned." They drove home in silence, but it wasn't the heavy silence of before. It was calm, peaceful, like the quiet after a storm. That evening, as they sat in the backyard, Sarah watched the sky change colors. "You know," she said softly, "when those officers pulled me over, I thought I was powerless. But maybe speaking up was power too." David nodded, his eyes warm. "It always is. Real power isn't in shouting. It's in standing tall and letting truth speak for itself." Sarah smiled faintly. "Then maybe that's what we did." David looked out at the fading light. "No," he said gently. "That's what you did." She turned her head and looked at him. "We did it together," she replied with a soft smile. For a long time they sat in silence, watching the stars appear one by one, tiny lights in a vast dark sky. It reminded them both that even the smallest spark of truth could brighten the darkest night. And that night, Sarah finally slept peacefully, not because the world was perfect, but because she had helped make it a little better. Weeks had passed since that night, the night that changed everything. The flashing lights were gone, the fear had faded, but the memory still lingered in small, quiet moments. Sometimes, when Sarah drove home after work, she'd glance at her rearview mirror and see a police car behind her. Her heart would tighten for just a second, not from fear anymore, but from remembering. Then she'd breathe, steady and calm, knowing that she was stronger now. Life slowly found its rhythm again. The children were back to their cheerful selves, filling the house with laughter. David returned to work busier than ever, but more focused, more mindful. And Sarah, though she looked the same on the outside, carried a quiet strength inside her that hadn't been there before. One Sunday afternoon, she stood in the kitchen, sunlight pouring through the window as she cooked lunch. The radio played softly, a local talk show. The host was discussing something that caught her attention: police community reform and empathy training programs, inspired by a local detective's initiative. She turned up the volume, her hand stilling on the counter. The host continued, "Detective David Williams has introduced a new training model in the Metro Police Department, focusing on empathy, communication, and de-escalation. The idea came after an incident involving his wife, Sarah Williams, which has since gone viral online for its powerful message about accountability and respect." Sarah smiled softly, her eyes glistening. She didn't expect her story, their story, to reach this far. But maybe it needed to. Maybe it was meant to. Later that day, when David came home, she met him at the door with a teasing grin. "You're famous now," she said. He laughed quietly, setting his bag down. "Don't remind me. Half the department thinks I'm turning into a motivational speaker. But you did something real," she said gently. "You made people listen." David looked at her thoughtfully. "No," he said softly, "we did. You spoke your truth. I just carried it forward." That evening, they took a walk through their neighborhood, hand in hand, watching the sunset melt into gold and pink. It was quiet, peaceful, almost symbolic. Children rode bicycles down the street, their laughter echoing in the air. Somewhere nearby, a neighbor waved from their porch. Everything felt ordinary, but in the best way possible. As they walked, Sarah said, "You know what I realized?" David glanced at her. "What's that?" "That night, the one where they pulled me over, it was supposed to make me afraid. But instead, it taught me courage. I think that's how life works sometimes. It gives you storms, but it also gives you strength." David smiled gently. "You're right. And maybe the point isn't just to survive the storm. It's to help others find shelter in it." They stopped at a small park nearby, sitting on a wooden bench under a streetlight. The world was quiet except for the soft rustle of leaves. Sarah looked up at the stars and said, "Do you think those officers really changed?" David thought for a moment. "I think they did. Maybe not overnight. But when people are brave enough to face their mistakes, something shifts inside them. I've seen it happen." She nodded slowly. "Then maybe everything that happened had a reason." He turned to her, his voice warm. "It did. Because now every time a new recruit walks through those doors, they'll hear your story. They'll be told about the woman who stood calm, honest, and brave, and the husband who refused to let injustice hide behind silence." Sarah smiled, her eyes reflecting the faint light above them. "I didn't feel brave that night," she whispered. David chuckled softly. "That's the thing about courage. You only realize you had it after it's all over." They sat there for a while longer, talking about life, love, and lessons. Simple things that suddenly felt big. Around them, the night settled peacefully, the stars bright against the dark sky. When they finally stood to leave, Sarah looked back one last time at the park, at the empty bench, the gentle light, the quiet world that kept moving forward. In that moment, she understood something deeply. Sometimes life doesn't give you justice immediately. It gives you awareness first, and that awareness becomes the start of real change. The road home was long and calm. Sarah leaned her head on David's shoulder as he drove, the streetlights flickering past like tiny memories. She whispered, half to herself, "Maybe the world isn't perfect, but as long as people keep learning, maybe it can still be good." David smiled, glancing at her softly. "That's exactly what I believe." Outside, the night sky stretched wide and endless. dotted with light, like reminders that even in darkness, there's always something shining through. And so, the story that began with fear ended with hope, not because everything was fixed, but because one small act of courage had reminded everyone what it means to be human.